let me introduce myself. Emil Ga. I'm working as a professional service consultant here in AWS in Poland. In fact, part of the European team. However, as you can see, my presentation deck is not branded as AWS. This is not a, let's say, official AWS talk. I will rather share with you some experience with my previous background, some real projects on customer side. So do not treat this as an official AWS slide. This is not official. This is something which I prepare personally and something which I would like to share based on my experience. So let me jump into this topic. So before I will start, I would like maybe to ask some question to you just to get some background information for myself. So how many of you have already or currently uses Kubernetes? Okay, everybody. So I'm sure the topic of backup should be familiar with you. So do you have already some solution in place for backup? Okay, less than half. Okay, so I hope that this presentation will be interesting for you. So let me share a quick agenda. Do you have any pointer and a laser? No. Okay. Sorry, that's my fault. Maybe I should be better prepared. So that's my agenda. So first of all, do we need any sophisticated solution? Because what I would like to show you, what I would like to share, what are possible options based on my experience, but based on some research which I've done for my project. So then I will briefly talk about what backup option we have. And something which seems to be natural, if we are talking about backup, we should have as well something in mind like a restore, which it's not always obvious as it should be. So I will share here some, let's say, more information about restore. And then, because this topic is related or mainly focused on some particular backup, Kubernetes backup solution, which is Velero. Previously, it was called Heptio ARK, now is part of the VMware, and I will try to show you how to use this in, first of all, to build some very simple proof of concept, and then how to make it more like a production ready. And finally, I will share some information, something which for production environment is, of course, needed. So information, how to make it secure and how to automate this, how to make it scalable and repeatable in high scale. So why backup? That's maybe very obvious question. Okay, just in case of some failure, in case of some people mistakes. But if we think about, let's say, from high-level perspective, and I will start with high-level, and very quickly I will go to some low-level details, is because we have some business SLA. We have some recovery time objective, so time when we need to restore our service. So that's like an answer to question why we need to have a backup, because we have our production environment, we have our business. So that's not like a technical issue, that's a business challenge. And if we think more about the generally backup in case of a Kubernetes, but backup generally, I would say that there are two main use cases. First is related to this business SLA, which is disaster recovery. So any case of failure, either by human mistake, which based on my experience, this is the most common type of failures. I don't know what is your experience, but my experience is that human factor still is the most important factor responsible for some issues. But then we can have any kind of a software issue, bugs, maybe corruption of HCD. And as well some security vulnerabilities, which, for example, can trigger us or can force us to, for example, upgrading. And before upgrade, probably we would like to have a backup solution. But disaster recovery is one of the cases. That's probably one of the hottest, the most critical. But then something which is like an extension, and particularly Velero solution, which I will present, is very good in this. This is for any kind of a Kubernetes migration. Migration between environment, maybe to migrate something from dev to production, or maybe the other way, to make some copy of production environment in our testing environment. Migration between Kubernetes version, migration, that's, I would say, target, maybe between different cloud providers, like from Azure to AWS. So these are use cases which are like an extension of a backup use case. So not only, do not think about only disaster recovery, but as well about Kubernetes migration. And finally, something which is important, because Kubernetes doesn't work in the air. Of course, we are in a cloud conference, but we have some kind of infrastructure, which it can be AWS, it can be Azure, it can be on-prem, bare metal servers. We have some infrastructure. And the target, the ideal backup solution is something which is independent from the cloud infrastructure or from on-prem infrastructure. It means that we can run it almost everywhere, but on the other hand, we are aware about cloud mechanisms. So maybe, for example, we could reuse some snapshot mechanism or some identity and access management. So that's like a reasoning or some let's say target goals for good backup solution for Kubernetes. And let me quickly present you some. This is based exactly on my experience on some project which I delivered in my previous job. So the first option which we can think, okay, we can save some Kubernetes object. kubectl get all. You know that this is not perfect solution. So that's, I would say, the most trivial approach, using some bash scripting to get all object, both namespaces on namespace scope and cluster scope. But here the challenge is that we need to think very carefully about all Kubernetes objects. And if we think generally about any kind of a backup solution, some kind of like our rescue tool, I try to make some comparison. And so for me, this is the first approach. This is like a swimming ring. So we can get some kind of a rescue, but it's more or less, this is not ideal. So I will explore this solution more in a few seconds. Let me present like a second option, which is a bit more advanced. So this is something which, in fact, you will find this recommendation in official Kubernetes or OpenShift documentation. So make snapshot of etcd. Etcd, this is like a Kubernetes database. So all Kubernetes resources, they are stored there. Okay, you can think, easy. Just making snapshot of etcd, everything is done. However, maybe sometimes you will not have access to etcd. If you are using, for example, some managed Kubernetes services, like, for example, AWS EKS, Elastic Kubernetes Services, you will not have any access to your master nodes. You will not have direct access to etcd. This is beauty of managed services. So maybe you would like still to have some solution which is a bit more independent of something which your cloud vendor provides. And if we think about the second solution, this is more like a Liveboy. So this is something which provides I would say, much more mature backup solution. Much better, you can rescue. This is not like a children toy. This is more like a professional. But finally, maybe you would like to have something which is much more sophisticated. So do not only take care about Kubernetes objects, about manifest of all resources, secrets, pods, persistent volumes, and so on. Maybe you would like to as well take care about our persistent data. Because, of course, Kubernetes, first of all, is about stateless application. But you are fully aware that in your cluster, in your environments, there are multiple applications which are stateful. And it would be good to have a solution, to have a backup solution, which takes care about as well persistent data. So that's like a next challenge. So if we think about this approach, for me, the third approach, which is like a combination of having both like a backup of Kubernetes objects together with persistent data, this is more like a live boat. So something which gives us much better rescue opportunity in case we are in trouble. And let's quickly explore this solution. So let's first look at the first approach. I mentioned about simple script. You can find some idea. Again, this is not recommendation. Please remember the picture which I use for this solution. This is for me. This is more like a children way of building backup. So So something which is maybe very good, quite trivial, but it will be quite challenging in maintaining and as well about keeping track of all objects. So how to back up all resources? Of course, if you use, for example, kubectl get all, it will not provide you all information, all your Kubernetes resources. This will not be a case. So you need to build your own script and somehow reiterate across all resources. And by the way, kubectl API resources, this command will give you information about Kubernetes resources. Do you know how many of them, more or less, are today? If you are talking about current Kubernetes version, how many Kubernetes resources we have? Here you have like deployment, secrets, pod service. How many of them? How many types of Kubernetes resources we need to back up to have a full backup? 10, 20, 50, 100? What do you think? It's about 50 currently. It's about 50. So building such script, of course, it is feasible. I'm not saying that it is not feasible, but maybe that's not most efficient way of building solution. However, if you would like to back up maybe your deployments or some namespace or something which you particularly are aware, that's the most important for you, that's right. But if you would like to have like a complete end-to-end solution, probably this will not be the best option. So second option, and this is here I put some outputs from Kubernetes cluster set up with access to etcd. So this here I set up this cluster with kube admin. So here the approach, and that's the approach which, if you look at the documentation of Kubernetes or OpenShift, that's, I would say, more or less best practice approach to back up your Kubernetes resources. So it means make snapshot of etcd. Of course, you need to have access to etcd, which means that, for example, some managed Kubernetes solution like in AWS Cloud or Google Cloud, this will not work. This only work in case, for example, if you set up your Kubernetes cluster with, for example, with kops, which means that you need to have a direct access to etcd. Okay, and this is because etcd is we can call this like a master database of Kubernetes cluster. That's complete. That's complete solution. Of course, it doesn't protect you against some corruption in etcd, or maybe there is if you have some cluster of etcd, you know that it can be set up in multiple ways. It can be together with master servers, master nodes, or it can be like a separate nodes. Maybe there is some out of sync in your cluster. So there is no 100% guarantee that this snapshot will always be fully accurate. So this was like a second option. The third option, which I investigated, trying to implement backup solution for Kubernetes environment, was looking at the open source community, and I found this project, which currently is called Velero. Now it's part of VMware. VMware acquired this company, but like a half a year ago, it was called Heptio ARK. And this is an open source solution. And from my perspective, this was the most mature and the most end-to-end complete solution which I found to back up the Kubernetes cluster. I will make, at the end, I will make a short summary, but now I would like to mention that it's open source. Despite VMware acquired this is still open source. There is very good support from community and for contributors. And people who are creating this solution, they are pretty knowledgeable about Kubernetes, and they're, I'd say, pretty well connected to Kubernetes community. So everything, at least for me, it was pleasure working with this solution because everything was natural. If you are working on daily basis with kubectl, with Kubernetes, this is totally 100%, I would say, compliant with Kubernetes in mindset. So that's something which I really like. And what is idea of this solution? So we have like two parts. So first of all, is like a backup of all Kubernetes resources. So we can call this as a backup of control plane. But as well, second part is a backup of your persistent data. So This solution is responsible for taking snapshot of all your persistent volumes. And what is good and that they support AWS, they support Azure, they support Google Cloud, and as well something which is, I would say, more like a generic backup solution, Restic. So you have as well possibility to use this for your on-prem or bare metal servers. If we look quickly at the architecture of Velero, this is an example of Velero based on AWS. This is the project where I run this solution. So what you can see that we have Kubernetes cluster, we have Kubernetes worker nodes, we have Kubernetes masters, and Velero, what you can see here, this is, we can call this as a server or like a controller. So this is part. If we talk about software piece, Velero is a Kubernetes pod. So when you are installing, when you are deploying Velero, we have Kubernetes deployment. I will present you how you can do this more like in some easier approach and as well with more automated. But generally, Velero is Kubernetes deployment, and real functionality works as a server. The reality is that Velero uses extension capabilities of Kubernetes. So this is just implementation of custom resource definition. So people from this team, they extended Kubernetes with their own API and added some backup and restore object using Kubernetes CRD. And what you can see here as a really basic architecture, I have more advanced picture later on, what are two main features of Velero? The first arrow is backing up Kubernetes resources. So in very, very simple approach, you can see that Velero is responsible for communication between Kubernetes API and S3 bucket. So all objects are stored in case of AWS, they will be stored in S3 bucket. So all our resources, all over this 50 type of resources, after contacting Kubernetes API, they are back up in S3 bucket. So that's like a control plane. And then in the bottom of this slide, you can see that we have like a second part of this solution, which is backing up persistent data. So what does it mean in case of AWS? So what you can see that, of course, in case of AWS, any kind of a Kubernetes persistent volume will be mapped to EBS, so to AWS EBS volume. And what Velero is responsible, so when you perform backup options, these EBS volumes, they are treated, the snapshots are taken. So that's, you can see with this high-level architecture, like a two main feature of Velero backup solution. Backing up control plane with all Kubernetes resources, and second part, which is backing up all persistent volumes, making just snapshot of EBS volumes. Let me continue. So what I'm presenting now, this is because I would like to make a short introduction to this solution, so you could see architecture. Now this is like an installation. I call this Hello Velero because this is like a first part, which is more like a proof of more like a pilot or proof of concept. And later on, I present more like a production-ready approach. So what are main steps? Something which probably you will find very natural, very obvious. We need to install client, which if you see that first approach, I call this Hello Velero. Why Hello Velero? Because, for example, in this Hello Velero, we are using just credential, which you know that based on like a state-of-art recommendation of any cloud, you shouldn't use credential to contact your cloud. You should use IAM, Identity and Access Manager. But this is Hello Velero. So that's something just, let's say, to build quickly proof of concept. So this is after installation of Velero client, then we need to have a bucket. So what you can see here that there is a bucket which needs to be created earlier, and we need to have a create IAM user. So again, this is basic, simple scenario. Later on, we'll replace IAM user with appropriate IAM assume role. And that's all. You can see single line. We have our bucket, we have our AWS region, and Velero is installed. Easy like this. Then let me present you, and if we have more time, I will present you with live demo. I have this setup prepared, but to focus how it works. So if you would like to create your backup of your Kubernetes cluster, very simple command, Velero backup create name of your bucket. And this single line is responsible for a total backup of entire cluster, entire Kubernetes cluster. So all Kubernetes resources from API perspective together with persistent volumes. However, there are some caveats that, for example, if we are using EFS, maybe you are using EFS provisioner to as well deliver EFS as a type of storage to your Kubernetes cluster, this will not be taken by Velero. I have some caveats later on. But for 95, maybe 99% of cases, this backup create, we have at least, we achieve our first goal that we stored securely some Kubernetes object in S3 bucket, and together we perform snapshot operation for EBS value. We can verify that our backup status is completed, and something which maybe you should be aware about expires that by default is 30 days. And then you can see some details about this solution. So I will talk later on, but here you can see that by default, all namespaces, all resources at cluster scope are backed up. Velero has very sophisticated or very flexible way what you would like to back up. So maybe you would like to back up some particular type of resources, maybe particular namespaces. That's possible, and you can use include and exclude option, just let's say to select something which you would like to need. Based on my experience as in project where I use Velero, we back up all cluster configuration, but when we use restore was much more selective, because I will present this later on. With restore, you have as well possibility to decide what you would like to restore and, for example, where. And as a last line, you can see that snapshots were as well completed successfully. So, of course, our backup goes to S3 bucket, and you have information. Maybe it's not fully visible. There are some logs. Again, credits to people who created this solution. Logs are really verbose. Logs are you can get real if you have maybe some warnings, some errors, some failures. The logs are very good. So something which help in troubleshooting a lot. So from any kind of like a maintenance perspective, that's very good. And you have all objects backup as a part of this tar.gzip file, which after unpacking, you can see a list of all resources which were stored, which were backed up. And additionally, you can find some details. If you prefer to have a CLI, you can go to CLI, and as well full listing of what has been backed up is available here. So that's like a control plane of Kubernetes cluster. Let me move to our data. So these are information about backing up persistent volume. So let's see that I have some application, some sample application with MySQL database, which have like a free persistent volumes. And when you can see that when snapshot is created, so when when backup process is executed, then snapshot is created, and we are getting tags, which very easily, even from the AWS perspective, it will help you to identify, okay, what is the source of this snapshot? Okay, you can see that this is taken as a Velero backup, name of the backup. And of course, if you would like to explore this with more details, you can find some that snapshot ID is exactly like in Velero CLI is the snapshot ID visible in AWS command line. The most important part, because so far we talk about backup, which is okay. It's of course it's mandatory. It's we must have a backup, but something which is even more important is our restore process. Again, some experiences. So your restore process can be like a sand castle. So you can think, okay, I have my backup, but when there is some, let's say, some failure, you are in trouble. Sometimes it can happen that your backup is not available. Somebody deleted this, maybe it expired. So sometimes this is like you can think, okay, this is my castle, but this is castle make from sand. Unfortunately, I don't wish you this experience, but it can happen. So here, recommendation: check always that your backup is really present. That's not taken. That maybe you are taking this not regularly, or maybe you need to backup. You need to restore something which was like a half year, 6 months ago, and you try to restore, and suddenly it's not there. The other type of backup, I would say, or maybe restore issue, is I put this tangle rope, which means that I have a backup. It's available, but it's not usable because maybe it's corrupted, maybe it's encrypted, maybe. I can give you some very simple example, not particular here to Velero. We had some backups, but it turned out that to restore from this backup, we would need to have like 3 days. Is your SLA good for 3 days? Your manager will accept this, your bosses? I'm not so sure. So that's like some obvious recommendation about restoring. Let's see that we are in a very good situation, and our restore is present, is available, is usable. So how we can restore with Velero? Very similar project, very similar approach as for backing up. So Velero restore create from backup. We are specifying the backup which we have. And then you can verify Velero get restore, backup was completed, and so it means that was successful. Here are some with yellow color, some information about wordings. This is something which is as well very good thing in this solution, because let's imagine that maybe you have a newer version of your objects. Maybe you have a new version of your deployment. So how it behaves, how Velero behaves. So if the current version of, if you have some, let's say, newer version of some objects, maybe deployment, maybe stateful set, then Velero will not override this. There, you can see that there is some warning, okay? This resource will not be restored because it already exists and is different from backup version. So here you can be sure that that Velero will not intentionally override your newer version of your data. And how it looks from the infrastructure, from the cloud infrastructure perspective, again, very similar. In case of backup, we have S3 backup. And for restore, we have S3 restore bucket. And again, you have information about logs and results. So that's all information about your restore. Let me present to you how it works from the perspective of, for example, persistent volume data. So how restore process works in case of a persistent volume. So here what I'm doing manually, I'm just deleting some persistent volume. So one of the MySQL member of my MySQL cluster. This is deleted from the AWS infrastructure. What you can see here that after this object is deleted from Kubernetes, then in AWS, in AWS infrastructure, there is only 2 volumes. One disappeared because it was terminated, because I deleted it just to simulate restore process. So how it works? So when I restore, you can remember I had initially 3 persistent volumes, 1 was deleted, and I need to restore. So only the missing one persistent volume will be restored. And what is happening in the background, that in background we are creating new volume from our snapshot. And you can see here again, we have 3 persistent values. Here we have 3 values, 3 EBS volumes, and one of them was created from the backup. And again, just to fully demonstrate you that this is proper restoration, you will see that we have like a 2 existing one, and the third one, which is restored, is properly restored. So this is like a demonstration of restoring process, first of all from perspective of Kubernetes resources, and here this is example of restoring persistent volume. If you would like to have maybe a bit more advanced restore example, that's something which again for me is like a beauty of Velero. You have multiple flags, because maybe it's good practice to, and that's a practice which we took to back up full cluster. But in case of restore, maybe you would like to exclude some objects. Why to restore kube system namespace? Why to restore maybe default namespace? You will know this according to your environment, your project. You can use restore flags and include or exclude some specific namespaces, resources, or labels. So if you have a good practice, good name convention for your labels, it's very efficient to, for example, restore just something which, last example here, with label app equals MySQL. And as well, some additional nice feature, namespace mappings. Maybe this is case of migration. Maybe you would like to migrate some original namespace from default to something specific. And again, you can use this switch namespace mapping just to change namespace for your Kubernetes resources in the restored cluster. And of course, something which you probably would like to expect, then all objects which are restored by Velero, they are labeled with appropriate restore tag. So it's easy to see which resources were restored, for example, for particular based on particular restore process. So far I talked about like a hello Velero. So now let's think how to make it more like production ready. So we need to think about some security, and if we have like enough scale, maybe our scale is like 20, maybe 50, maybe a few hundreds of clusters. So definitely we would like to automate this. In terms of security, and this is specific to AWS, we would like to eliminate direct usage of AWS credential and instead to use IAM roles. So here in the implementation which I use, we use kube2IAM. There is other solution which is kube-IAM. So there are 2 solutions. You will find some information, some trade-offs between 2 of them. But entire kube2IAM is needed to have a control on, to get access to AWS resource to your pods. So here, if Velero, which is Kubernetes pods, Velero executes some operation, maybe snapshots, maybe accessing S3 bucket, of course, it needs to have some IAM. It needs to have some access rights. So that's way when we need to implement some IAM role to eliminate direct usage of credential. And of course, if you would like to improve our security, we would like to encrypt S3 bucket, encrypt EBS, and as well implement some keys to manage all of this. Something which is very helpful in case of AWS, if you would like to investigate what kind of privileges you need, I would recommend you looking at CloudTrail logs. In CloudTrail logs, you can see, okay, some action, some access, for example, to EBS snapshot was denied because your privileges are not enough. So you remember my basic architecture picture? Here is extended, first of all, with IAM role. I would say that this is quite complex part because you need to map EC2 instance role, which is like a Kubernetes node role, to particularly to your Velero IAM role. I have some information here later on, but this is not like a complete picture. And of course, using encryption, so to encrypt S3 bucket and as well have a control on to have encryption of our EBS volume and EBS snapshot. So here is an example of IAM policy. So what you can see here, if you are not familiar with AWS, so here are like a specific permission which are needed by Velero. So first of all, left side, you need to provide access to snapshots and volumes, of course, because that's like a part which is responsible for persistent volume. And right side, this is access to these are access privileges to S3 bucket and as well some privileges needed for KMS if you are using your, for example, your specific key to encrypt your data. So this is very briefly. Of course, there is in real life there is much more behind, but these are like key elements related to security. Then automation. In my case, it was Ansible. Again, here is just a single task. Of course, if you look at the main modules of Ansible, this is about automation of IAM role and policies. So that's something which will deploy. Let's say that you have automatically many clusters. You need to have some IAM role to deploy multiple to deploy this on multiple clusters. You need to have some way to automate S3 bucket. And finally, Velero deployment. I think that probably you can find multiple examples on Ansible deployment with IAM and S3 bucket. So I put here something which is the most important for this part. So how to install, how to deploy Velero, but now not with the simple CLI, but with Helm. So there is already a Helm chart available for Velero. And here you can see that in Ansible, I'm using shell. There is Ansible Helm module. However, this is not advanced enough. So that's the reason why I decided to use like a Helm with this shell inside of Ansible. So you can see here very similar installation that here we are using this chart and we are using namespace, name which we would like to give and version as well. The most important parameters for Helm chart for Velero, apart you can see that this is like a template. So of course we need to put version which we would like to deploy. But something which I emphasize here, this is pod annotation. So you could see that I provided some information that we need to have specific IAM role. We need to provide specific access privileges to Velero. So we created, in previous example, we created specific IAM role. To use this role, we need to annotate Velero pod. So this pod annotation. This is the way how we are telling, okay, your Velero pod will use this AWS IAM role with privileges defined in previous slide. And as you can see here, that credential secret use false. We are not using credential. Instead we are using IAM roles. And again, some two parts related to Velero basic functionality. So storage location, of course, your S3 bucket, which will be used for backups and for restore. And as well your snapshot location, which is your AWS region. And here, when the Velero is deployed, you can see that if you would like to display some more detailed information about your pod, you will see that this annotation is applied to your pod, which means that your Velero pod will use this IAM role to access AWS resources. Okay, I think a few minutes more. So let me make some notes of Velero. My experience was very positive. And something which I would like to share, I already mentioned that that's very good community support. You can find these guys on Slack channel, on GitHub. They are very responsive. So despite this, we use this as open source without any commercial agreement, any commercial support. This community was really helpful. People are really knowledgeable. So these are like a top expert, very closely connected to Kubernetes community. So people who created this from Heptio company, you will find some, let's say, big names from Kubernetes community. It's open source, so that's like an additional advantage. Verbose logging, very detailed logging, very easy to find some issue. In my case, the most problematic part was finding right privileges needed for Velero. So that's why I shared this with you. I as well shared some information related how you can make this process a bit easier. For example, using CloudTrail logs. Volume snapshot takes time. What does it mean here? Velero, when you create your backup, then it will very soon you will get complete. It means that API calls were completed. But for example, if you are taking snapshot first time and your persistent volume is like a few hundred gigabytes, it will take time. So do not, for example, try to immediately restore. So what I'm saying that you are performing Velero backup action, completed, but please look at the AWS console or AWS CLI and verify that snapshotting finished, because this snapshotting can take a few hours if it's like a first snapshot and your volume is quite big. That's like a nature of snapshotting in AWS. I put here a comment that not possible to make a very selective restore. You could see that there are some flags related to resources. There are some flags related to namespaces. However, for example, you cannot use directly regular expression. That maybe you would like to have some specific name of some specific object. That's not to this extent. But still, possibility to use some selective restore are quite good. No direct EFS backup. Velero uses concept as a snapshot. So if it's AWS, if it's Azure, if it's Google, only volumes, let's say natively, only volumes which can be snapshotted are handled natively by Velero. There is some support for more like a generic backup solution, which is Restic, which treats any kind of volume, Kubernetes volume, because in Kubernetes there are multiple types of volumes. And you can experiment with this approach using Restic to, for example, backup if additional type of volumes, like, for example, if you are using EFS. I don't have experience with backupping EFS. That's like another part, but just to make you aware. And first point, of course, it can be created as a cron job. You can use a schedule as a part of a Kubernetes cron job, or you can use some Velero's flags just to set up right schedule time. That, for example, to perform this, I don't know, every day. Last slide, my summary. So first of all, prepare your backup. Then the second, test your resource. 3 things to remember: backup, test your restore process to be sure that your restore is available and you can access this. And if your scale is big, then automate this. And why I put here this sailboat? I should mention this in the beginning. Velero is a Spanish word for sailboat. So that's why I put here a sailboat. So Velero is żaglówka po polsku.
Guys, we still have 2 minutes, so if you have any questions, feel free to ask them right now.
Okay, so I've got one question, because it seems that this solution is excellently tailored for full backups. For example, if I want to create a full backup, it's excellent. But what if I would like to prepare some kind of service, maybe rather solution, that should offer a point-in-time restore, like AWS RDS, for example? Let's imagine that I would like to have similar functionality. Is it possible to use Velero in that case?
I would say it is possible to use Velero as a starting point. But that's, let's say, point in time restore is not part of Velero by default. So you can use, let's say, the feature, the functionality which I presented, but you can use, of course, schedules, but that's not part, let's say, today of Velero.
And another question, you said that the community is very mature for that product, but let's imagine that I would like to to use Velero not as a command line, for example, but just like an API? Is it possible somehow to combine Velero with Python or Golang?
Of course, because what Velero, I didn't talk about this, but Velero is like an extension of Kubernetes API. So this is like a custom resource definition. So this extend Kubernetes API, and you can use Velero API I would say as natural, the same way as you are using Kubernetes API.
Excellent, thank you.
Yeah.
Have you tried to use Velero with custom resource definitions with other operators?
And I don't have my personal experience with this.
Okay, another question. Did you try to restore the backup to the different cluster?
To different cluster? Yes. Yeah, that was one of the, I would say, main tasks. Yes.
Was it in the same region or zone?
Yes, it was in the same region, in the same cloud. Maybe just a comment. If you can think that with directly, you cannot, for example, restore from one cloud to the other cloud. You need to use this RESTIC approach. But restoring like from to the same region or to the other region within the same cloud provider, that's part of like a base.
And last question, what about the compatibility between versions of Velero?
There is some what I could see that they are keeping compatibility with the previous version. And you can find some release notes information about relation, for example, to Kubernetes API, because there are as well some changes. For example, for example, in one of our cluster, we had quite old version of Kubernetes, and we need to, for example, modify a bit Helm chart to use this. So generally, to some, if it's not like backupping or restoring between like 2 or 3 version of Kubernetes wasn't any issue. But if like time difference, this is like, for example, from version, I don't know, 1.8 to 1.13, then you need to do this more, let's say, manually. That's still feasible, but you need to tweak this.